Okay, we are live. Good evening and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. We are coming towards the end of Masechet Shabbat, but I'm not convinced that we're going to get there tonight. We're only on chapter 21 and we've got to get all the way to chapter 24, but we can give it our best shot, right, guys? I've got my faith in you. Hopefully you've got some faith in me. To all those watching after the football, I really hope that Spurs won. Okay, so without further ado, here we go with chapter 21 of the Mishnah. We haven't got it on the screen yet, have we? No, come on. What are you playing at, man? Can everyone see it now?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
You can see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so to all those thousands watching on Zoom, to the millions watching on YouTube, let's go with chapter 21 of Masechet Shabbat, where we are talking still about some halachot to do with muktzah, things which may or may not be handled. And so we start off talking about a stone. A stone is fundamentally muktzah, but what we're going to see is you can touch something or someone that is holding a stone. So the Mishnah says, "No tel adam es beno v'ha'even biyado." You are allowed to pick up somebody. You're allowed to pick up your son while he is holding a stone. V'chal kala v'ha'even b'socha. Or you're allowed to pick up a basket with a stone inside the basket. U'metaltalin teruma tamea im hatahora v'im achulin. You're allowed to pick up teruma, which is impure and which otherwise shouldn't really be handled because there's not really much you can be doing with it. So you're allowed to pick it up if it's in the same space as teruma, which is pure, or if it's in the same space as chulin, which are items that are not sanctified. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, you'd even be allowed to pick up a mixture of generally perfectly fine produce, but which the trouble is that a piece of fruit that was designated for teruma has also fallen inside, and so the whole mixture becomes problematic. And yet Rabbi Yehuda says you'd even be able to pick that up, even though you're not necessarily going to be able to consume the food that's inside it, and so the whole thing becomes questionable and useless on Shabbos. Nonetheless, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you'd still be allowed to pick that up. Continuing with Mishnah base. If you have a stone that is on top of a barrel, so you'd think, well, maybe you can't pick up the barrel because it's got a stone on it, but we know that we can because we just said we can pick up items that have got muktzah on top of it. Question is, how are you supposed to get that stone off if you want to access the contents of the barrel? So the Mishnah says, "Mata al tzida v'hino feles." So you can tip it on its side so that the stone falls off. Haisa beina chavios. What if it's stuck? It's on a barrel which is inside all of the other ones. So what should you do then? Says the Mishnah, "Magbiha mata al tzida v'hino feles." You should pick up the barrel in question, even if it's from the middle of a bunch of other jugs, and then you can bring it over to where you need it, tip it on its side so that the stone falls off. What if you've got money on your pillow? Ma'os she'al hakar. If you have money that is on top of your pillow, your cushion, no eres hakar v'hein no flos. So then you can shake the pillow around so that the coins fall off. Haisa alav lishleshes. What if the pillow has got some dirt on it? I love that. If snot is on your cushion, brilliant. Mekancha bismartut. So you are allowed to wipe it with a rag. The point I think that we're trying to make over here is that you wouldn't be able to start washing the cushion because then it could enter into problems of laundering, of cleaning something on Shabbos. But to wipe off the dirt that is on it would be okay. Haisa shel or, if it was made out of leather, which would be a waterproof material, So you'd actually be allowed to pour water over that until the stain or the blotch disappears, and that wouldn't be a problem of laundry because it's not the way to wash or to clean leather in that way. And so rinsing it off or cleaning it off in that way does not constitute laundry when it comes to leather. So that is why the difference in the halacha is as it's presented in the Mishnah. So if it's fabric, then the Mishnah is telling us that one should not be wiping that and spraying it and doing liquid-based procedures of cleaning. But if it is something like leather, then one would be able to. Continuing with Mishnah Gimel, Beis Shammai Omrim. Beis Shammai say, Magbihin min hashulchan atzamos uklipin. That if you finished your meal and you've now got your scraps left on the table, according to Beis Shammai, you are allowed to lift up those scraps, those bones and those nutshells from the table. And the reason is because what gets left over by humans can be eaten by animals. So according to Beis Shammai, they don't become muktzah because there is some usage for them at this time. Beis Hillel say differently, and they say no teles chula menara. You are allowed to lift up the whole table and shake it off, and that would be because, according to the opinion of Beis Hillel, it would be a problem to start handling all of these items that have not got any use. Ma'avirin milifnei hashulchan perurin pachos mikazayis. So you're allowed to remove table crumbs that are smaller than the size of an olive, and that's because bigger than that, when it comes to breadcrumbs or pieces of bread, one should be very careful with how they get handled and not just discard them freely. The seah shel afun and the seah shel adasim, and you can take off the they call it husks, okay, but the shells or the pods or whatever of different beans, the seah shel adashim, and the remnants of lentils, mipnei shehu machal behema. So I guess like this, Beis Shammai also agree that you can take off things that are machal behema, but I guess according to them, bones and those kinds of remnants, nutshells, you're not necessarily going to feed to animals. But when it comes to breadcrumbs and when it comes to shells of beans and things like that, so those things would be fed to animals according to Beis Hillel. Sfog. What about a sponge? What if you want to start wiping down the surfaces? So the Mishnah says, "Im yesh lo or beis achiza mekanchin bo." If it has got a handle that you could hold the sponge with to be able to wipe down the surface of the table, then you can do so. V'im lav ein mekanchin bo. But if it does not have one, then you shouldn't wipe down the table with it. And the reason for that is because as you're holding the sponge, which is now saturated with water, and you start wiping the table with it, you run the risk of squeezing the sponge and the liquid therein, and that could be a problem on the Sabbath. So, the Chachamim say, Ben kach u'ben kach, nital b'Shabbos v'eino mekabel tuma. The sages say, the Chachamim say, in either event, Ben kach u'ben kach, you are allowed to handle a sponge on Shabbos, and there is a caveat here that it should be dry. So a dry sponge can be handled, whether it has a handle or not. Ve'eno mekabel tuma, and separately to that, it does not transmit tuma if it comes into contact with something which is tameh. It will not become contaminated, which is unlike other things made out of cloths and metal and those kinds of things. So that's a unique din when it comes to a sponge. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing chapter 21. And now, unless we have some questions, we'll move on to chapter 22. Chapter 22 it is then. Okay, so nice, only 9-10 minutes in. So chapter 22, we're going to deal with things which Okay, so chapter 22, Chavis Shenishbara. We've got a barrel which is broken. Now we came into contact with this kind of answer when we were talking about your house, a house catching fire and the person needing to save the items inside. And we talked about the need to save enough food for 3 meals or for 2 meals or for 1 meal. And the whole reasoning behind that for all of these different institutions was that if you become so overwhelmed with making a loss on something, you may come to fix it. You may come to fix the problem. And so what we're going to be talking about here are things where the person is going to undergo a loss, but we don't want them to get so overwhelmed with needing to save it. So we need to create a bit of a separation between the problem and the solution. So a chavis shenishbara, we've got a barrel that has broken and there's wine that's spilling out. So the Mishnah says, matzilin heimena mazon shalosh sudas. So the person may only save enough food for enough wine, for 3 meals. Now I believe the reason is fundamentally this: there's no problem with taking all of the wine, but again we have to be careful that this person's not going to be so overwhelmed with the problem of losing the wine that he's going to end up fixing the barrel, which would be a problem on Shabbos. So he can save enough for 3 meals. And if you remember what we said when it came to a fire, we can notice over here, it's not distinguishing between Friday night, Shabbos day. It's saying as a blanket rule, you can save enough for 3 meals. And also you can say to other people, come and save for yourselves, as long as nobody is going about collecting the wine up into any kind of sponge or any kind of fabric entity which you would then go and squeeze out in order to save it. So there are dimensions here where a person still has to be very careful that they don't come to violate any malachas on Shabbos while trying to save their merchandise or save their belongings. One is not allowed to squeeze fruit in order to get the juice out. But if it comes out by itself, then and if it comes out by themselves, then that juice will be prohibited. And the reason for that is because we don't want people to say, well, I'll just give it a little bit of a squeeze myself if that juice is going to be allowed. So the first position in the Mishnah is that if any liquid is coming out of fruit, one cannot use that on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im la'ochlin, Rabbi Yehuda says differently. If it is for food, hayotzi mehen mutar, then what comes out is going to be permitted. Ve'im lamashkin, hayotzi mehen osur. And if it is meant for drinking, meant for the juice, then that which comes out is forbidden. So, on a kind of rudimentary basis, if you were squeezing orange juice over your fruit salad or whatever, then that would be one thing. If you were trying to squeeze down a whole bunch of oranges in order to make yourself orange juice, then perhaps that would be a good distinction over here. Continues the Mishnah, Chalos Davash, when it comes to honeycombs, Sheris Kan Me'erev Shabbos, which have been crushed before Shabbos, V'yatzu Ma'atzman, and now the honey is dripping of its own accord, says the Mishnah, Asurin, the first position in the Mishnah says that it would be forbidden to take this honey on Shabbos. But Rabbi Eliezer Matir, Rabbi Eliezer permits honey which is coming out of its own accord if the honey has been crushed in advance of Shabbos. And actually what's interesting, the halacha goes like Rabbi Yehuda in the first part of the Mishnah and like Rabbi Eliezer in the second part of the Mishnah. So we don't end up ruling completely stringently when it comes to usage of juices, different types of juice and liquids on Shabbos. But it does pay to look at this more in depth to be able to know what the right and wrong things to do are on Shabbat. Continuing with Mishnah base. Kol Shabbat v'chamin me'erev Shabbos. We're going back, guys, to talking about bishul. We've not talked about bishul for weeks already, but we're back on to talking about cooking tonight. Kol Shabbat v'chamin me'erev Shabbos. Anything that had been in hot water before Shabbos, shorin oso b'chamin b'Shabbos, is allowed to be soaked in hot water on Shabbos. The cooking procedure has already taken place and nothing is going to be added. I'm sorry, there's a couple of bits of clattering that's happening in my ear, so I do apologize. I'm just going to mute you. But if you do need to make any comments, then please do unmute yourself. So, kol shelo ba b'chamin be'erev Shabbos, anything that has not been heated up in hot water, cooked up before Shabbos, medichin oso b'chamin b'Shabbos, says the Mishnah, you may rinse it with hot water on Shabbos, and we're not going to be concerned that there's going to be any cooking procedure taking place with this short exposure to hot water. But there is an exception. Anything that is called kalei bishul, anything which is very easy to cook, these things are not going to be allowed to be rinsed on Shabbos. So that's why the Mishnah says as follows: chutz min hamaliyach hayashan, with the exception of salted fish, v'dagim meluchim ketanim, and very small salted fish, v'kulias ha'ispanin, and Spanish coleus, some kind of Spanish fish which had a soft and thin skin, and so it was very easy to cook. And the reason is shahadachasan zuhi gemar malachtan, when you rinse them in the hot water, so the surface that gets touched by the hot water instantly starts to cook. So these things would not be allowed to be put into hot water on or to come near to hot water on Shabbos. Continuing with Mishnah Gimel, we learned back in chapter 13, Mishnah 3, Perek Yud Gimel, Mishnah Gimel, we learned that you're not allowed to destroy things. And we're now going to modify that ruling ever so slightly when it comes to things that you are destroying in order to eat. So Mishnah Gimel says as follows: Shova Adam es hachavis le'echol hemena grogros. You're allowed to cut open a barrel in order to get the dried figs to eat. Uvilvad shlo yiskavin la'asos kli, as long as you are not making this barrel into a kli, as long as you have no intention of making it into a kli. And if this sounds a bit familiar, we see these kinds of issues cropping up when you're opening jars of pickles and tins of tuna and all these kinds of things. So this is the way in which this topic expands into relatable terms, right? We're trying to open up a jar, a tin, a barrel, whatever it is, of food, and one has to be careful that by doing so we're not turning this thing into a reusable vessel. And we are not supposed to pierce or to perforate the whole of a barrel. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim permit. And with all of these things, we're talking about doing this in an unusual way. I have a note here saying that when we're talking about opening up this barrel, or this cask as it translates it here, we're talking about cutting it open with a sword, like taking a big swipe through it. So when it's done in an unusual way, or you are piercing the whole of this barrel in a way that anything could fall into it, so the Chachamim's position, actually, the sage's position, is that it should be mutter. Says the Mishnah, though, one should not pierce it on its side. And if it was already perforated, so you're not supposed to put on wax, because that is going to be a problem when you start smoothing it out. We have an av malacha of mamachik, of smoothing things out. So the derivative of that would be something like smoothing out wax to cover up the seal, to cover up the perforation. So one would not be allowed to do that on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, there was a situation that came before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai when he was in Arab, when he was in Arabia. I have a note here that says that he spent 18 years living there. So this kind of situation came before him, that somebody must have gone and put on a wax seal to the side of a barrel. And he said, I have the feeling that he may be liable to bring a sin offering, meaning I have a feeling that he did the wrong thing over there. Continuing with Mishnah Daled. So we're talking about things here which are probably fundamentally permitted, but they could be construed as being problematic on Shabbos, so one has to be very careful. Mishnah Daled. Is that where we are? Yeah. Nosnin Tavshil. That's why we're not in the right place there. Nosnin Tavshil L'Tuch Habor B'Shvil Shehei Shamar. You are allowed to put a cooked dish into a pit in order to protect it. Now, why is this a problem? Because a few chapters ago, back on chapter 4, we said that you're not allowed to do hatmana. You're not allowed to bury something because you can't put it anywhere that's going to insulate the heat of the contents of the pot. So we're not talking about that here. We're saying you're allowed to put it in a pit as long as it's just a normal hole in the ground, and you're not going to be covering it up, and you're not going to be trying to insulate it. That's not what we're talking about. So the Mishnah says you're allowed to put it into the pit so that it can protect it. And you're allowed to put a pot of good water or hot water into baraim, into foul water, in order that it should be cooled down. You're allowed to put something cold water into outside under the sun, the heat of the sun, in order that it should be heated up. And the reason for that is because heat generated by the sun is going to be okay on Shabbos. A person whose clothes fall off while they are walking and they fall into water, so you can put them back on and walk with them without any concern. What are we going to be concerned about? We're going to be concerned potentially about the clothes getting squeezed out, and yet the Mishnah is telling us that one would be allowed to do this on Shabbos. Continues the Mishnah. But once you get to your outer courtyard, you can spread them out to dry in the heat of the sun. But you're not supposed to do this in a way that is visible to the public. And we're taught that is because of Maris Ha'ayin. We are taught that is because people may see you and get the wrong idea. They might think that you are doing laundry on Shabbos. And you're not. All you're doing is just trying to dry off your clothes that got wet. So that is something which fundamentally is permitted to do. You're allowed to lay the clothes out that have got wet in order that they should dry from the sun. But you wouldn't be able to do this if in a place where someone would see it and be led to think that you had been doing laundry. You're even not supposed to do it in your house and to put it in a place where people are going to think that you're doing laundry there. So that can have all kinds of repercussions if you are walking home from shul and your clothes get soaking wet. One has to be careful to put them in the right place so that people don't get an idea to think that you're doing laundry on Shabbos. Mishnah Hay, Mishnah 5. Harochet b'mei ma'ara. A person who is washing themselves in the water of a pit, uvamei Tiberia, or in the waters of Tiberias, v'nistapag, and he then dries himself with afilu be'eser aluntias. He dries himself even with 10 towels. The implication being that each one of those 10 towels is not going to get so wet. So the Mishnah says, Lo yivien biyado. You should not then take them in your hand, and that's because you may end up squeezing them, which would be a problem. 10 people would be allowed to use the same towel. I don't recommend this for standard practice, but 10 people would be allowed to use the same towel to wipe their hands, their faces, their feet, and they'd be allowed to take that towel back with them, because the assumption here is that 10 people walking together, they'll keep each other in check and make sure that no one ends up trying to wring out what would probably be a very soggy town. Continuing with Mishnah Vav. Sachin umisham try that one again. I'm not going to edit out for the camera, but here we go. Sachin umishashmashin bivnei me'ayin. A person is allowed to apply oil and to gently massage bivnei me'ayin, the body. It translates it there. Avalo misamlin velo misgaridin. The person should not interesting. Step on the body. I've got rub the body. Velo misgaridin, should not scrape the skin. I've got a note here that says, and that's because this would be the way that you would do it during the week, and so you would not do it like this on Shabbos. Continues the Mishnah, Ein Yordin LaKordima. One should not go down to. Anyone heard of a piloma? I've never heard of a piloma. I've got here a river. It's the part of the river that would have a very muddy floor base, or it would be a bit not quicksandy, but you could end up getting stuck in the mud over there. So one should not go down to that part of the river. Ve'ein osin apik tevizin. Why one would do this, I do not know. But one should not consume anything that will induce vomiting. Yeah. So the reason, by the way, for the river is that it could end up leading to schita, to squeezing things. As for vomiting, I'm just trying to take a little look here as to what specifically the problem is. It just says that it's.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I think it's something I was learning Gemara with my cousin some months back. I think it's something that the Romans did, and they did it so that they could actually eat more. They gorged and gorged. And so they did something so they were sick, so they could then eat more food.
Wow. Thank you.
And that's what it comes from.
Thank you very much. It's so lovely when it all pieces together, isn't it? Something that you learn over there and you hear it in the Mishnah, and then one day you'll be learning your Gemara and you'll be like, hey, what about these people that used to induce vomiting? And then it all links up. It's amazing. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Continues the Mishnah. Ve'ein ma'atzvin es hakatan. One should not straighten the bones of an infant. Ve'ein machzirin es hashever. One should not set a broken bone. Actually read somewhere that if the infant had just been born and there was some need to adjust its limbs for whatever reason, then you would be allowed. But if not, then we enter into a problem where it looks like you are building something. It says here, the reason that this would not be allowed is mishum de mechse kabone. It looks like you are building. But that only applies if you're dealing with a situation further down the line. But if it's on the day of their birth, then it would be allowed. And on the point of not setting a bone on Shabbos, a broken bone, it says that the halacha is not like this Mishnah, but the halacha is that one would be allowed to set the bone on Shabbos. Misha nifraka yad over ragla, a person who has dislocated their hand or their foot, lo yitrafein betzonen. They should not agitate it violently in cold water. Aval rochetz hu kadarko, but they may bathe it in the usual way. Nisrapan. If it ends up healing, then it would heal. I wasn't even aware that was a way of relieving the pain of a dislocated hand or foot. But there we go. Mazel tov, nonetheless, on completing chapter 22. We've only been going half an hour. So the question becomes, do we go for chapter 23 and finish next week? Or do we do and then start a new one? Or do we do, where does it start? Oh, down there. We could go on. What do you guys think? What do you want to do? I'm seeing nods. Everyone all right? So let's do it. Chapter 23. This one's for you, Mark and Jeff. What's the score, by the way? Don't tell me. All right, so we're going to be talking about things which we don't do on Shabbos because of uvda d'chol. They are things that would be more associated with weekday-like activities. So let's check it out. Shoel adam mechavero kadeh yain v'kadeh shemen. A person is allowed to borrow jugs of wine and jugs of oil on Shabbos from his friend. Uvilvad shelo yomar lo halveini. But as long as he does not say the very words halveini, as long as he says lend, as long as he doesn't say lend them to me. V'chein ha'isha mechaveret ha'kikaros. And similarly, a person who borrows loaves from her neighbor, she should not say again this word of halveini. And the reason why it would seem is that the difference between borrowing, right, she'ilah, and halveini, this kind of loan, is the person is going to be more likely to make a record for themselves, to make sure that they get it back. And we have to be concerned about that. So we have to be able to borrow items in a way that is not going to lead to a person feeling concerned that they're never going to see it again. So we can lend things out that the person's not going to expect to get back. No one's going to expect the same loaf of bread back. No one's going to expect the same jug of oil if you've gone and used it all. So these things, the person is not going to feel the same kind of pressure to make a note of what's being taken. So so that is why the Mishnah phrases it in that way. And if he does not trust him, so then he should leave his cloak with him as a pledge, and then they can fix it up and square it up like that. Squares up with him after Shabbos. Similarly, if you are in Jerusalem on Erev Pesach, and you need to be able to get hold of your Korban Pesach, so Erev Pesach is falling on Shabbos, so you can leave your cloak with him. You can take your Korban Pesach, and then you can square up with him at the end of the festival and make sure that everything is settled. Mishnah base. Moine Adam es orchav ve'es parparosav mipiv. A person is allowed to count his guests and to count how many desserts he's got to be able to give out to his guests. He can do that by word, but he shouldn't do that from a list. And that's because we're concerned that the person might erase as he's going through the list, or might kind of make some alterations in some way to this list, which is going to be a problem on Shabbos. A person is allowed to cast lots with the people in his house around the table over who should get which portions. As long as we're not going to start measuring up different dishes against each other, because that could lead to gambling, or could be a type of gambling which could be a problem, and it can lead to problems of measuring on Shabbos, which we're not supposed to do. And the Kohanim are allowed to cast lots for the different sacrifices beyond Tov, but they're not supposed to do that for the portions from the previous day's korbanos. Continues with Mishnah Gimel. Lo yiskor adam polim b'Shabbos. A person is not allowed to hire workers on Shabbos, and that's because you should not speak about your business in this way on Shabbos. V'lo yomar adam l'chavero liskor lapolim. And you're not allowed to speak to someone and to ask them to hire people on your behalf. One is not allowed to walk over to the edge of the tchum, of the border. So we might be familiar that a person is not supposed to walk beyond the confines of their town more than 2,000 amos, right? So what the Mishnah is saying over here is you can't walk yourself to the end of the Tchum, so that as soon as Shabbos goes out, you can be right in there and dive right in and go and find the worker that you want to hire so that you can hire him, ulahavi Paris, or go and bring produce in, which the only reason you were really going to the edge of your town was to be able to do these things which you aren't allowed to do on Shabbos. So aval machshich hu lishmor umevi Paris biyada. However, if you were going to the edge to be able to do something that you'd be permitted to do, right? So if it's just to guard your field, which you're allowed to do on Shabbos, you just can't go in there because it's too far away, but you can place yourself at the very edge so that immediately after Shabbos you can go and guard the field. So if you do that, the Mishnah says, maybe Paris biyada, then you'd be allowed to bring back fruits, to bring back Paris with you. What's interesting, I missed before though, when you're asking your friend to go and hire workers, you're not even allowed to discuss with your friend to say, listen, after Shabbos, can you go and hire me this guy, that guy, whatever. So even if the person that you're asking is going to do this work for you after Shabbos, we're not allowed to ask him on Shabbos to do that work for us or to have that work in mind after Shabbos goes out. Klal Amar Abba Shaul, there is a rule that Abba Shaul set forward. Kol she'ani zakai ba'amirasot rashai ani lahachshich alav. Anything that I would be allowed to say on Shabbos, or to ask for, or to do on Shabbos, I'm allowed to put myself in a position that immediately after Shabbos I can go and deal with that. So that is a very interesting rule. It's all interesting. On to Mishnah Daled. Machshichin al hatachum lefakeach al iskei chala. I'm allowed to put myself at the border so that as soon as Shabbos goes out, I can go and attend to the needs of a bride. Or I can go and deal with a deceased person. That I can go and organize their coffin, I can go and organize their shrouds. But there is an interesting caveat for this. Goy shehevi chalilin b'Shabbos, a non-Jew who brings a flute, reed pipes on Shabbos, lo yispod bahen Yisrael. They should not use this to stir up people's emotions and eulogize over a Jew. Even if he came from a near place. The presumption is that this person was bringing this instrument for the sake of the Jew, and so you cannot benefit from what he did on Shabbos, even after Shabbos. Asu lo aron v'chafru lo kever. But if he had made a coffin for himself, this non-Jew had been doing it for preparing a coffin for a non-Jew, or had been digging a grave for a non-Jew, Yikaver bo Yisrael, then you'd be allowed to bury the Jew in it. V'im b'shvil Yisrael. But if the non-Jewish person had done these things for the sake of a Jew, lo yikaver bo olamis, then the Jew may never be buried in such a space. So, Mishnah Hey, talking about things again, benefiting from malacha that had been done on Shabbos, or more precisely, the things that you would be allowed to do for a deceased person on Shabbos, because a deceased person is not supposed to benefit from a Jew's malacha. But here are the things, I believe, that you would nonetheless be able to attend to with a deceased person on Shabbos. Osim kol tzarchei hames. You are allowed to perform all of the needs of the dead. What do we mean by that? Sachin medichin osa. You'd be allowed to anoint them with oil and to give them a rinse. But as long as you do not move any of the person's limbs, and that's because the dead person is in a state of muktzah, and so we wouldn't be allowed to move we wouldn't be allowed to touch and move the body. You would be allowed to remove the pillow from underneath him so that the person can be, says, to put them onto the sand, in order that they are in a position to be better preserved. So this means that you'd be allowed to do whatever you needed, I guess, to maneuver the person into a place that is going to be of put them in a better situation, a better place. Kosher mesalechi, you're allowed to tie up the chin, to tie up the jaw. Lo sheyaleh, not that you'd be ordered in order to close the mouth, ela shelo yosef, but only to prevent it from opening further. Similarly, v'chein korah shenishbara, if there was a roof beam that had broken, somchin or safsal, you'd be allowed to put a bench underneath it and support it, or ba'aruchas amita, or bedposts underneath it. Again, lo shetaleh, not in order to lift up the beam and close it up, ela shelo sosif, but in order that it shouldn't get any worse. Ein ma'amtzin es hameis b'Shabbos, you're not allowed to close the eyes of a dead person on Shabbos. V'lo b'chol in yitzias hanefesh, you wouldn't even be allowed to do this on Shabbos if it was a person who was on the brink of passing away. V'hama'ametz in yitzias nefesh, if you were to close the eyes of a person who was dying, harei zeh shofech damim, then you could be considered a murderer, because you could be bringing about the speedier ending, the speedier demise of that individual. So Mazel Tov on completing chapter 23. We will save chapter 24 and finish excitingly next week all together. So that's it for tonight. We still got 3 chapters done. So that's huge. That's huge, everybody. So let's stop there for tonight. We'll pick it up next week. I will wish you all a wonderful night, a wonderful week, and we'll see you all again soon on Mishnah Mastery.